From a boy that could eat anything and did, to the outright dehumanization of other peoples, these are disturbing parts of history that we wish could be erased. Up first is Saint Sharing. Humans are weird. Really weird, and perhaps the only thing that can rival how weird we are is our craving for idolatry and meaning. Combine those and you just might end up sleeping with the mummified remains of a saint in the hopes that it'll cure you of whatever horrific medieval disease you've contracted. When you've been put down with shattered kidney or explosive ghost blood, the only thing that can save you is rubbing a centuries-old mummified saint's hand all over your face. Or exhuming the recently deceased body of an alleged miracle worker and cuddling with it all night. Yes, these are all true stories, most of them coming from the Spanish Habsburgs, although plenty of rich people like to fall asleep with a withered skull in their hands. Up next is TARRARE. TARRARE was less of a man and more of a bottomless stomach. As a child, he could eat a quarter of a cow in a single day and was never full. Neither was he overweight. Despite devouring his body weight in food daily, he weighed only 100 pounds. He initially worked as a street performer, swallowing objects whole until he suffered an intestinal blockage, which brought him to the attention of medical personnel. He was discovered to be able to fit 12 eggs inside of his mouth, could open his jaw over 4 inches, and could wrap his skin around himself when he was hungry. When he was full, he would bloat to a massive size. He eventually did seek out a cure for his condition, but despite staying in hospital for months, never satiated his hunger. He would sneak out and eat trash, drink the recently exhumed patients, and frequently raided the morgue. He was only kicked out of the hospital, however, after a 1-year-old was discovered missing, though nothing definitive has ever been proven. Up next is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale is often seen as the mother of modern medicine, a saint who wandered the rows of wounded soldiers and brought them back to health. In truth, she's a more complicated figure. Yes, she led to the creation of the profession of nursing and was a massive propaganda tool during the Crimean War, but she also refused to believe that washing hands was necessary for a very long time, even railing against it, and only later in her life showed any regret for denying one of the most basic medical discoveries in history. It's likely that the horrific amount of disease during the Crimean War was in part due to Florence and nurses like her not washing their hands between patients. Next are the Radium Girls. There was a horrifying period of time between when radiation was discovered and the broader populace found out just how dangerous it was that radium was considered a miracle cure. Radium was prized for its glow-in-the-dark ability, which led to it being painted onto watches, clocks, and all manner of other things that needed to glow in the dark. For the men who handled the massive barrels of radium, intense protective measures and warnings were installed and given out. But for the women who were painting the radium on, no warning was ever given about the well-known dangers. These women were even told to lick their brushes to ensure that the tips stayed fine, and often painted their teeth and faces in radium before going out on a night on the town. It would take years before the combination of increased education, social pressure, and the utterly horrifying consequences of extreme radiation poisoning led to any of the surviving women seeing any sort of compensation or apology. Next is the Cadaver Synod. When Pope Stephen VI ascended to popedom, one of his first actions was to exhume the buried corpse of his 7-month deceased nemesis, Pope Formosus. Pope Stephen mounted the cadaver onto a judge's bench and held a trial, accusing the deceased pope of all sorts of heinous things and stripping him of his papacy. This was generally considered to be not cool by the rest of the country, and Pope Stephen was soon overthrown and replaced by another pope that then reinstated Pope Formosus' papacy. Next are the Jellyboys. This is outright dehumanizing. British officers in the East India Company occupying India began to get tired of the insects that they had to deal with in the hot Indian climate. So instead of just accepting that insects are a fact of life, these officers came up with something entirely different and utterly horrifying. Jellyboys. Young boys who would strip to their undergarments and then be slathered head to toe in jelly. All of the insects would then swarm the Jelly Boy, leaving the British officers free to enjoy a round of golf without insectoid interruption. Could you imagine being slathered in food that probably cost more than your entire family's yearly wage just so some rich guys in a safari hat don't get bitten by insects? Of course, with the amount of diseases tropical insects can also carry, these Jelly Boys rarely lasted long. Next are civilized expositions. Heavy sarcasm on the civilized part. During the height of colonialism and the transatlantic S-trade, the wealthy and powerful needed a way to encourage their people to join in on the brutality. Humans are social animals, practically built to see ourselves in others, and so dehumanization was needed. Indigenous groups from around the world had members kidnapped and dragged to literal human zoos. From the Inuit to the Xhosa to the Igorot, indigenous peoples the world around were kept in zoos as displays, forced to wear primitive and savage clothing that they would not otherwise wear, to convince Westerners to feel no sympathy for them and to portray them as little more than animals. These zoos often had horrific conditions and very fast turnover of the captives. Many of these stereotypes fostered in these zoos are still alive and kicking today. Up next is the 60s scoop. One of the darkest stains on Canadian history is that of residential schools. These were horrific places designed to eliminate all presence of Indigenous culture through routine harm, cruelty, and manipulation. These schools began in 1831 and lasted until 1996. But alongside this horror were many other tools used to break apart families and destroy generations of culture. One such thing was the 60s scoop. Under the pretense that Indigenous families couldn't care properly for their own, 20,000 Indigenous youth were taken from their homes and put into the foster system to be adopted by explicitly white families. This lasted from the 50s to the mid-80s and is one of many horrific crimes against humanity in Canadian history. Next is the United Fruit Company. Nothing matters more than money in this world. Not a nation's stability, not the life and happiness of its people, nothing. Essentially, the United Fruit Company integrated themselves into South and Central American governments with bribes and highly predatory contracts, and then essentially turned the entire nations into indentured servants. These companies controlled the postal service, the telephone and telegraph, the rail lines, the farms, and essentially every single piece of infrastructure within these countries. When these banana republics actually began to fight back, the United Fruit Company and many other fruit companies funded mercenary squads that hunted people down in the street. The United States also assisted in several coups to ensure profits continued rolling. And finally is Nanking. Due to terms of service restrictions, I have to be very careful about this topic, but it must be covered. After the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and Shanghai, the Imperial Japanese Army came upon the city of Nanking. Over the course of 6 weeks, the city would be turned into a graveyard. Roving bands of soldiers hunted civilians for sport in the streets, and careless brutality was not only expected, but encouraged. Over 200,000 civilians would perish in the 6-week horror, and afterwards the city would become one of the primary testing sites of Unit 731, a Japanese unit that used human experimentation for biological and chemical weapons. Japan would not even officially recognize the crime had happened until 2013, and the nation has never officially apologized. Those were disturbing moments in history we wish we could erase. I hope you found this valuable, and I'll see you next time.